Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Wednesday. It's time for our midweek study in the book of Daniel. So glad you've taken the time to listen to this study, either in person or later on listening to recording. It makes no difference to me. I just pray that it's an encouragement to you, because that's my whole desire for doing all of this, just to share my love for the Hebrew language. And we're going to find out more about another type of language that we find in Daniel, and be able to share that with you also. So, as you look at your screen, and we are in Daniel chapter 2, and this is where things just start to get so exciting, and what makes the book of Daniel such a interesting study. Remember that Daniel and his Hebrew friends are being tutored by the king, being groomed. They're now his advisors, and many, many years go by. And as we finished last week, thought that, you know, 60, 70 some years have passed, and finally something goes awry in the kingdom. So here's where we pick up. Um, Uvishnat, which is in the year Shetayim the second, Lamalchut, which is the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. And here we see some interesting words. So this is the king, he's reigning, and Halam, and this is the word for have a dream. And so it says, dreamed Nebuchadnezzar, and then the next word is halomot, which is the plural of dreams. So dreamed Nebuchadnezzar dreams. So he had numerous dreams, and it says he was so troubled. And this is an interesting word. When someone is troubled in the biblical passages, it's always leads to something. And so I always find it interesting to take a look at that word and see, well, what does it mean to be troubled? To me, it's a very difficult word to explain. It's like when we are going through things in our lives, people will ask you, well, how do you feel? Well, we'll say fine or not fine. We struggle trying to define um, our emotions. And so, let's see, did they have the same struggles back then? It says he was troubled, and it comes from the word pa'am, and this word pa'am means to thrust or impel. And what I always find interesting is that this word is not used very often in the Bible. It's used just the five times here, translated as anxious, stirred, troubled. But then we look down at the root of this word in etymology, where it comes from, means to be thrust, being impelled. So you can kind of feel that it's something that comes from within, that really is deeply rooted. And here it also has a primitive root of tapping, like tapping your hand, of or beating regularly, given the understanding that your heart is racing, and that this racing heart causes you to move, causes you to be agitated. And so, okay, King gets this dream. His heart is beating wildly in his chest. He's so troubled, and if he can't sleep, nobody else is going to sleep either. So it says his spirit of sleep left him, and this might have been at 2 a.m., and he yells out in verse 2 and commands to call everybody around him, all of his supporters, all those that give him counsel. And again, he uses these terms that are very challenging for us to understand in our day and time, but it is very common with what we see in other biblical narrative. We see that he calls the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans. And the magicians, astrologers, and sorcerers, those words are somewhat common if you have read through the book of Exodus, where the children of Israel and Moses and Aaron are before Pharaoh, and this interchange discussion is taking place. Pharaoh would have these same type of people around about him, and so we just want to take a look here at what the Hebrew commentary has to say on these couple verses before we go any further. So it talks about the word dream in a plural, that the dream is intensified, and that he's had other dreams. So we talk about these people, the Chaldeans. This is probably the first time you may have heard of this word. It's not used very often, and so we're going to take a look at, they're important to know where they came from, and who they are. So they have astrologers, people who knew and were supposed to be the ones who really counseled him. So let's go back to our uh, verse and continue. And so he reaches out, wakes all these guys up, brings them in, and said, "Oh, I'm excited. I had this dream." And they're all standing there, and he says in verse 3, Vayomer lachem hamelech Halom, I had a dream. Halam mati, and this is the word for I had. And then vatif em, which is somewhat of the same root as we looked at here, for being troubled. So he says, I'm anxious. I had this dream, and and my spirit left me, and I'm anxious to know what this dream meant. Okay, all sounds pretty normal. Then we get to verse 4, and this is where it really becomes interesting. And so sharing with you something that I've been very interested in, and happy that we have the opportunity to delve into it a little bit in this passage of Daniel. And starts out, via Beru spoke the Chaldeans to the king in Aramaic. Um, you may never have heard of Aramaic before, and so that's why it's something that I've been very interested in, just early in my studies, I guess right now, of the Aramaic. And so I get a chance to share with you a little bit about what I've learned and why Aramaic is so important in the Bible, because from this part on, where they speak from this word Aramit, which is Aramaic, the next word is Malka, which is king. And it is in Aramaic, because if you look prior to this, it's Melech, which is Hebrew. And so here the language switches. And for the next numerous chapters, the language switches from Hebrew to Aramaic. Again, not widely well known unless you're studying Hebrew or studying Aramaic, but this has become a fascinating study for me. So I want to give you a little bit of exposure today about what Aramaic is. And so to do that, we're going to take a look at just a little introduction to Biblical Aramaic. I'll include this in the email that goes along with the link to the YouTube study. If any of you are subscribers and I'm not familiar with you, you're not on my email list, please just toss me a note and I will be happy to email a PDF of this. It comes from a book called Biblical Aramaic, a reader and a handbook that I've been studying, and it gives you a much better information on what Biblical Aramaic is. There are 269 verses in the Bible that are in Aramaic, and that's out of 23,000 verses. So while it's only 1%, it is still it's a biblical language. And it is, again, a lot of discussion over Aramaic, and I'll share more about that as we continue our studies through the next few weeks. So here we go. So the Aramaic, here's a short history of where it was and in modern times. But what I find most interesting that I want to share here is that Aramaic was the common language used in the biblical area from 200 BCE or BC to 200 CE or AD as it used to be called. So during this intertestamental time, if you will, when Jesus walked on the earth, when the disciples walked on the earth, up through the early times of the church, through 200 AD, Aramaic was the language that was spoken. It was a standard language. Now, for us living in the Midwest, in Western culture, especially in the United States, we are very much monolingual. We speak English, and while Spanish is quite thought to be a second language in many different parts, it's a debate in the United States, over speaking English and the adaptation and inclusion and acceptance of other languages. And that's unfortunate because every other culture throughout the world, they are multilingual. I mean, I went to a restaurant in Brussels, Belgium, and the waiter spoke 5 different languages because of the cultural influence, and he had to speak that to just be on his job as a waiter. And it just blew me away. It made me somewhat ashamed that I only, speak English along with rudimentary Spanish and we'll say Hebrew and learning Aramaic, way behind other cultures. So what we have to be reminded of is this was a culture back in the time of Jesus where they were multilingual. So Aramaic was spoken in the everyday home, marketplace, get together with friends, the common language of the day. Greek culture was influential. It was kind of fading by that time, and Roman culture was taking over. So there were still some remnants of Greek being spoken in different areas outside of this area of Jerusalem and Israel that we were talking about. We'll learn more about that later. So some spoke Greek as far as using it in some of the culture, the higher arts and um, cultural things that they talked about. Latin was the language because they were being ruled by Rome. So that was the governmental language. Hebrew was the religious language because they spoke Hebrew and read Hebrew in the synagogues. And so very, very multilingual. So here we also see that there were regional dialects. The Aramaic spoken by Jesus was one of these dialects. Something that substantiates this is a uh, large group of biblical text known as the Targumim. And Targumim is just a word that means translation. And it is a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic because at that time frame, Hebrew was less familiar than Aramaic was. So this is a translation, and Onkelos is one of the more prominent um, scribes who translated the Targumim. And so, again, this is very interesting because it gives you another understanding about what the Hebrew could mean to them in their modern vernacular and during their modern time, being the turn of the millennial. But to those who are Aramaic speaking, but had the Hebrew background. Also, there was a Syriac dialect and that was developed during this period. And the Christians spoke um, and had that as their common dialect. And this is before Greek took over later on in about late 200s to 300 third century. So there is a New Testament and Old Testament in Syriac, which is related very commonly, very similar to Aramaic, but you may have heard the word the Peshitta, which is the name of the Syriac Bible in those days. So this is all very fascinating to me, and I hope you don't mind as I share some of this learning because it helps us to be able to understand as we start to study some of these Aramaic and Syriac New Testament documents and gain value for the enhancement of, okay, here's what Jesus spoke, the actual language that he spoke when he was teaching them on the hillside, when he was teaching them and talking to his disciples, that he spoke to them in Aramaic. And so we can gain a deeper insight and have about the same experience studying the Aramaic in the New Testament as what we can have studying the Hebrew in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible to gain just deeper knowledge and not be restricted to a later translation of the Greek. And again, this is all study that's coming into its own. For many, many centuries, it was thought only to study the Greek of the New Testament, and but yet now new scholarship, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and other documents that are being found show us that Matthew most likely wrote his book of Matthew in Hebrew, and some of the other ones were written in Aramaic. And so, again, it's not to replace one with the other, but it's to add to what we already know and to help us bring us into a better understanding of maybe some of the words that could give a deeper meaning and a little bit better understanding. Because I don't know about you, but there are things I read in the New Testament that I struggle to understand. I go into the Greek and I'm not as versed in that, just did a little bit of studying in, and it's still not as clear, but I've done some research in some of the words in the Hebrew of Matthew and in the Syriac, Aramaic, and it just helps enhance that and brings out some of the cliches and some of the um, common commonality, the phraseology that's used that just sheds some light on some of these. And so I hope to be sharing that with you. Even to this day, in a Syriac Orthodox Christians who call themselves the Assyrians, they speak Syriac. There's a large enclave of Assyrian Syriac Christians down in the northern side of Illinois. They have temples set up there. And again, the Church of the East is what's associated mainly with the Syriac Orthodox Christianity. It centers itself and comes from the Iraq-Iran area, which is where the Apostle Peter had spent a lot of time starting churches there, and they separated from the Western um, Christianity, which was centered more in Rome and stayed with the Latin Vulgate that Jerome translated about 300 AD. So again, very fascinating. We are very highly influenced by Western Christianity from the Rome side of it, from the Latin side of it, and we know very little about the Eastern Christianity or the Syriac or Assyrians, but again, it fascinates me, and I have a number of studies on it, and I find that it's very fascinating to gain knowledge from that side of it. And also, there's still some Neo-Aramaic dialects that survive to this day in small, isolated Christian areas in Syria. And again, there's biblical scholars, linguistic scholars over there right now trying to talk to them, gain understanding of their dialects, and put together a dictionary, if you will, of their language so that it can be used to give us greater light on some of the phrases, like when Jesus was on the cross, he spoke in Aramaic, and okay, is there another? Some think there might be another meaning that instead of saying God, why have you forsaken me? The Syrian language would help us to understand. He's saying, why is this taking so long? This is my destiny, and let it be finished, because he died and gave up his spirit immediately after saying those words. And so, does it change a lot? No, but it helps us just to have a better understanding and grow a little bit closer to it. So, I will attach this document to the um, next when I send this study out. So let's go back to while we have just a minute or so here. We're going to just finish up verse 4. So they spoke back to him in Aramaic and butter him up, live forever. And then they said, basically, tell us the dream and we'll give the interpretation. And the king pulls a fast one on him here, and he goes, no, that's not how it's going to work. I'm not going to tell you the dream. I want you to tell me what I dreamed and then tell me the interpretation of it. This is pressure to the max here. Um, he's really wanting to hold them to the task and saying, if you're so smart, if you can tell me the interpretation, you should be able to tell me the dream. Again, this is probably very highly unusual, but he wants an answer. And I believe you can see God's hand in some of this, motivating the king to do something that he has never done before. He didn't forget the dream. It wasn't like with Joseph telling the Pharaoh what his dream was, because there the Pharaoh had forgotten the dream. This guy knew what the dream was, but he wasn't going to tell them. He wanted to have them tell him, and then he could be sure that the interpretation would be for sure. And of course, he puts the pressure on them and said, "If you don't tell me." And if you can't tell me this, the dream and the interpretation, I'm going to kill you all. You're going to be cut in pieces. Your houses will be it says made into a ash heap, and we'll come back next week and take a look at some of these very colorful, very fascinating words that are in this verse 5, and just see how strong of a threat this was to these wise men, wise people, and why they were undoubtedly very, very shaken. So, well, God bless all of you. Thanks again for listening. Hope you enjoyed this new embarking as we study here, and I look forward to sharing again with you next week. Bye bye.